Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm sharing the clubs for February 2026 for Spellbinders. We have the clear stamp of the month called Ears to Spring. Lots of different sentiments in that, as well as some images. Then we have the stencil of the month, which is Botanical Bunny. This is the embossing folder of the month called Spring Stripes. And then the 3D embossing folder of the month called Shady Leaves. I love that background. I think that one's going to get a lot of use. Then we have the Better Press and Foil of the month. This is called From Ink to Petal. This month, instead of a roll of foil with that press and foil plate, you get a layering stencil that coordinates with it, creating a really unique look. This is the stitching die of the month called Spring Stitched Tree. And then we have the die of the month called Spring Haul, and I'm actually going to create 2 cards with that one. The large die of the month is called Spring Specs. That bunny is absolutely adorable, and those eyeglasses for him to wear. This is the Crate Club bonus item. It's called Season of Faith. It's a great die set. I'm going to create a light up card with that one. And then lastly, we have the Crate exclusive die set. This one is called Lively Blooms. I love those unique flowers. So before starting any cards, I'm going to create a bunch of sentiments. I'm actually going to heat emboss all of the sentiments from the clear stamp and die of the month. That way I have a ton of sentiments to pick and choose from while I'm creating. Because I haven't used this set before, the very first thing I do anytime I open up a new clear set is I use a white eraser on the stamping surface. It removes any possible manufacturing residue and helps that stamp take ink. This only needs to be done once, so I do it the very first time I use any stamps in the set. And I know if I've used a stamp in a set, I've done that to it. I don't need to do it again. I have a piece of hammer mill cardstock here, and I'm just laying my sentiments on it. Like I said, I'm going to create a bunch of sentiments. I'm not actually going to be able to use all of them in this video, so the ones that are left over, I'll just save them with that stamp set for future projects. That way I know exactly where to find them. I'm using my Misty stamping tool so that I can stamp multiple times to make sure that I get nice, crisp, clean sentiments as well as images. And I also used a little bit of embossing powder tool on that cardstock and then stamped with Versamark ink. This way, when I go to pour my embossing powder on there, it's only really going to stick to that Versamark ink. If I have any oils from my fingers, there's a good chance that it won't stick to that because of that embossing powder tool. So for these sentiments as well as the images, I'm going to be using gold embossing powder. And because we have a lot of sentiments here, I'm using superfine embossing powder for it. It just gives you a little bit of extra detail. If by chance there's any powder where I don't want it to go, I just use a small brush to brush that away before using my embossing tool in order to heat that powder. So I'm going to do the sentiments first, and then I'm going to do the images from that set, embossing those as well. And I'm going to do my die cutting all at the same time as well. So I'll save the images for the card that I'm going to create off to the side, but I might as well do it all together while I have my Misty out, while I have all the tools for the embossing out. And I always love the embossing because it just gives you that extra little raised edge. Here it's gold metallic because that's what I chose. So you get that metallic tone with it too. It just gives you a little bit of extra texture. So once those sentiments are done, I can set those off to the side. I can clean off my stamps. I just clean them off with a damp microfiber cloth. It's nothing fancy. It's not a special ink or anything, so that microfiber cloth will work just fine. For the images, I'm using hammer mill cardstock as well, putting them on that background, and then I'm going to stamp them. Some of those extra tiny images I'm going to stamp a couple times so that I have more butterflies as well as more clusters of flowers. So once again, I'm using that embossing powder tool over that cardstock, stamping with Versamark ink and stamping a couple times to make sure that I have a nice, crisp, clean image. I'll clean that stamp set off, put the ones that away that I'm not going to be using again, and then I'll move the ones that I will be using. Now, my stamp is probably still damp from that damp cloth, so I'm going to be careful when putting them down. I want to make sure that I don't accidentally get any moisture where I don't want it to go. Then I'm going to stamp it once again with that Versamark pad, and I'll pour that embossing powder on top of here. And anytime I'm embossing, I'm using a piece of scrap paper underneath there, so anything that doesn't get stuck to that ink gets poured right back into the container before heat embossing these images as well. And there's dies to coordinate with all of the images as well as all of the sentiments in this set, so it will cut all of those pieces out. The great thing about this bunny border piece here is the die only goes over that top edge. So you could create the underneath part of that as thick or as thin as you want, so you have a lot of choice there. So when I'm matching up my dies, I like to use a piece of Best Ever Craft tape to tape those dies down. I want to make sure when I'm moving everything around, putting it to my die cutting machine to die cut them, it's not going to move on me. And those pieces of Best Ever Craft tape I use over and over again. I can probably use them 5 or 6 times before it doesn't really stick too well anymore, and then I just toss it. So I get a lot of use out of a roll of tape. So I'm going to tape all of the dies down all at once, and then I'm going to die cut them all at once. The only time I don't do this is if by chance my dies overlap each other. You don't want dies overlapping each other going through the pressure of the die cutting machine, because you're going to ruin your die. I didn't have an issue with that for these ones. When I was placing those sentiments on my cardstock, I was keeping in mind making sure there was space all around each one of them so that I could put those dies in all at once and not have that issue. But if by chance you're putting your pieces a little bit too close and your dies are overlapping, just put one of the dies on, leave it the other one for the next pass through. We don't want to ruin our dies. So after doing all of these pieces, I do have to do the pieces that the flower clusters and butterfly that I did a second image of. I did that off screen. For my very first card, I'm going to use that 3D embossing folder of the month, the Shady leaves. I'm going to create a super simple card here, but I just really loved the look of those leaves. There's a technique that I love doing, and I do it quite often, where I ink the background of my embossing folder. So here I'm inking it with some tumbled glass as well as broken china distress ink. I do tape my paper in my embossing folder so I don't have to worry about that moving around on me. And I use the stacking on my die cutting machine for a 3D embossing folder. Now this step gets repeated as many or as few times till you get the look that you want. I think I did it 4 times here. You want to just take a look at your backgrounds, how much ink you have on there, and the look that you're trying to go for. You'd keep doing it until you have as much ink as you want on there, or as much coverage as you want on there. I wanted to have the background of this card blue for the sky, and then I'm going to do some ink blending for those leaves so we have some green leaves to it. So I start every single time I do the inking on that background there, I start off with the tumbled glass, which is the lighter color, and then I go in with the broken china. I'm trying not to get too much of that broken china ink on my tumbled glass pad. It's not going to ruin it if I get some of that ink on there, but I don't want to darken my pad too much. So once I have the coverage that I like, I'm going to take this piece out of my embossing folder. And the great thing with the distress pads is they're just a dye-based ink pad. So to clean off my embossing folder, I just run this under the tap. I don't need to use any special cleaner or any soap or anything. It'll just run right off just using water from the tap. So this piece here, I am going to mat it with a piece of cardstock that I'm going to ink, and that is going to be 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. My embossed piece here, I'm going to trim down to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. So I'm going to have a little bit of a mat all the way around it, and we're also going to see the white from the card base behind that. So for my mat, I'm using bundled sage as well as peeled paint distress ink. We're going to go all the way around that piece here, and then we're going to use those same 2 greens for the leaves on my embossed background. So for the mat itself, I did the bundled sage all around, and then I did the peeled paint towards the bottom. When it comes time to doing the leaves, I'm going to first do the bundled sage over the whole thing, and I'm trying to be light-handed. I'm not trying to get too much green on that background. We may get a little bit. It may tint or change the color of the background just slightly, but we're not going to see a lot of green on that background. That's why I'm being light-handed. Then I have a detailed ink blending brush, and I'm using that with the peeled paint. This is the darker of the 2 greens, and I'm just inking that on the base of each one of those leaves. This detailed brush is a smaller one, but it's about the size of the base of the leaf, so the inking goes really quite quickly, but it adds some color variation to those leaves, gives it a little bit of visual dimension and a little bit more interest. Now, the ink is basically the only way I'm enhancing this embossed image. This embossing folder, it looks great even just using it with white cardstock and just leaving it as is, but I really love the color to it as well. I think it's one of those embossing folders that it's nice and basic. You can create a very simple card like I'm doing here, or you can get more elaborate with it. Like, I'm not going to do anything other than adding a sentiment to this. I want to keep it very simple, but you could, if you wanted, add some flower die cuts to this, and I think it would be absolutely beautiful. So with my embossed background done, I can glue down my mat. I'm using some Barely Art glue for all my gluing. It's in a fine line bottle, so it's going to work great for assembling my cards here. It's also going to work for the cards where I have die cuts that I'm assembling. That fine bottle with that tiny tip there makes it really easy to assemble even the tiniest of die cuts. After putting that embossed background down, I put the sentiment down, and I just pick and choose from the stamped and embossed sentiments from that clear stamp of the month. Because I have them all done, as I'm working and going along, I can pick which sentiments work best for the cards that I'm creating. That's one of the reasons why I just do them all at once. It takes no extra time, but it's nice to have that selection sitting there waiting for me. For my next card, I'm going to be using the Botanical Bunny stencil of the month. Once again, I'm working on hammermill cardstock. I'm putting my piece on a sticky mat, and even though that stencil has a little bit of a border, a little bit bigger than that cardstock, I am using some painter's tape to tape it down just to make sure that it's holding that whole piece down and it's not going to move and shift on me. Then I'm using a large blending brush in order to put some peeled paint distress ink down. Now I want to do a combination of distress inks as well as interference inks. I love the look of the distress ink and the color variation you get, but I also like adding a little bit of that interference on top of it for that little bit of shimmer. This one here is Summer Garden, so we're going to see, when we're looking straight at it, we're going to see mostly the green, but when you tilt it into the light, it's going to have a little bit of that blue shimmer. And if you've never seen interference inks, I have a whole playlist where I use them in many different ways. They're one of my favorite inks to work with. They're kind of like a magic pad. They have one look on white or light cardstock, and then a completely different look or different color on black or dark cardstock. So they're really fun to play with to get a variety of different looks. And in this case, really what I'm going for is adding that little bit of extra shimmer in certain areas. And I'm going to be using the interference inks in combination with the distress inks in, I think, pretty much every card that I do in this video, because I just love the look of them. For that second layer of that bunny, I used the bundled sage distress ink for that layer. For this one here, I'm going in with some Kitsch Flamingo. And when I do these pieces, I don't make sure that my ink is completely even throughout. I do some areas where they're lighter, some areas where it's darker, and I personally like it better because it just gives you a little bit more of an interesting look to it. But if you prefer complete and even coverage, you can absolutely do that. For this layer, I used a little bit of Sunset Pink interference ink. This is an exclusive one to scrapbook.com. It is a beautiful pink color, but it has some gold shimmer to it. So it coordinates beautifully with that picked raspberry ink pad that I am using throughout this video. It is a nice bright pink like that, but when you tilt it into the light, it has some gold shimmer to it. For this next stencil layer, I used the picked raspberry distress ink, and then I also used that Sunset Pink interference ink. So, and once again, just like the distress inks, I'm not doing that interference over the entire thing. I'll typically do it towards the base of a flower or in areas where I have the ink darker. Now, one of the things that I love doing with layering stencils is I like to choose one layer and use some Moondust Stickles glitter gel. This is an opalescent glitter gel, very similar to Stardust Stickles that I like to use in the centers of flowers. I do it for that entire layer. I will make sure that that layer is the last one I stencil. I took a dry cloth and wiped off any ink from it, and then put on that Stickles glitter gel with a palette knife, leaving it on my mat, and I let that dry for about an hour so that it could dry completely. While it's drying, the very first thing I do is clean off that gel off my stencil as well as that palette knife. I don't want it to dry on there. Then I'm taking this piece here and I'm trimming it down to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches, as well as another piece of hammermill cardstock that I trimmed down to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. For the larger piece for my mat, I'm using that picked raspberry distress ink and just going around it really quickly to do the mat on it, or to do the color on it. Now you could easily use solid colored cardstock here. Because these stencil layers are ink blended, I do ink blending for the mat for that because I just think it blends together a little bit better. But again, you could easily do solid cardstock if you prefer to avoid that ink blending. After that, I'm gluing these down to my card base. Now I also did do a little bit of ink blending on my sentiment. I just thought it would pop off of that bunny just a little bit better. Now I changed my mind just before gluing that bunny down. I wanted to add a little bit of color on that white cardstock. So I'm using some tumbled glass distress ink, just doing a little bit of light ink blending, adding just a hint of blue to it right around the edges. I'm not doing it over the whole thing, but I just thought it would add a little bit of color to that background and just frame it just a little bit better. Once I'm done that, I can glue that to my card base, and then I can glue down my sentiment. So again, this is a really simple card. The thing that took the longest was waiting for that layer of Moondust Stickles glitter gel to dry. But when you look at the finished card, you get a combination of the distress ink as well as the shimmer from the interference ink from both the Sunset Pink as well as the Summer Guarded. And then you really get that dimension from the Moondust Stickles glitter gel as well as the sparkle from it. For the next card, I'm using the image pieces from that heat embossed stamp, the Years to Spring clear stamp of the month. I'm just going to color them quickly and easily with some Tombow markers. So I'm starting with 491. This is a really pale blue. I'm using that for the egg in the image. Then I'm using 673. This is a light purple. I'm going to use that for the butterflies. Then I'm going to go in and do the dots on the egg with that same color. Number 817 is kind of a dusty rose color. I'm going to do the flowers with that color. And of course, any of these colors can be changed. I chose colors that were similar to the distress inks that I was using for different ink blending and whatnot throughout my cards, because I wanted this particular card to coordinate with that as well. But you can easily change the color palette of any of the ones that I'm using. 991 here is a nice pale yellow. I'm going to use it for the bunny as well as we're going to have a die cut egg that is going to be added to this card. That die cut egg is from the die of the month. I just got die cut some solid pieces of cardstock. For the greenery, I'm using 076. That is going to be for the grasses. So I'll do it at the bottom of the flower clusters as well as the bottom of the little border here, just following the lines of the embossed grass pieces there. So once we have this completely colored, we can start trimming things down for our card. So for the image piece, I am going to take a piece of hammermill cardstock. I trimmed it down to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches, and I thought I would use some gold embossing in order to frame it. Now you could also use some gold cardstock if you wanted it to look a little bit more pristine. This gives more of an almost mixed media type look to it, because when I rub that Versamark pad along the outside edge of the cardstock, some areas are going to be a little bit thicker and some are going to be a little bit thinner, but it's going to coordinate beautifully with the gold embossing on the image because it's going to be the exact same shade of gold. It's just a nice way to frame things in gold when you have something and you don't necessarily want it to be pristine and perfect, or say a layer of gold cardstock underneath it. This gives that framing of it with that gold, but it's just a different way of doing it. So after doing that heat embossing, I'm going to take those 4 different colors that I'm using for most of my backgrounds. I've got bundled sage as well as peeled paint for the greens. Then I've got tumbled glass and broken china for the blues. I really like that color combination. I wanted the cards, again, to have a very similar look or feel or color tone to them. So for my backgrounds, I did these same colors throughout. You can always change them if you prefer, say, like weathered wood or something that's a little bit more of a gray blue rather than a turquoise blue. You could always change that up. So after doing that tumbled glass, then I go in with the broken china, and I pretty much do that broken china around the outside edges, just making the outside a little bit darker. Same with my greens. I did the bundled sage first, and then I did the peeled paint towards the edge, just framing a little bit. Then I also used the peeled paint underneath my grass here. I wanted to tie that in with the card base, and it kind of blends it into those colored pieces of grass. Now I can take that border and I can tear it basically off of the piece that it was die cut from. I didn't want to do it until I had decided whether I wanted a vertical or a horizontal card, but I know now that I'm going to be doing vertical. So these are the 3 eggs that I die cut ahead of time. These were die cut out of some beeswax cardstock, blush cardstock, and then some waterfall cardstock. And I just wanted them to have a little bit of shimmer to them as well. So I took the Lisa Horton Pearl Pad. I've used this a few times in videos. It creates a bit of a shimmer. For light colors, you don't really see much other than the shimmer, but for darker colors, you would get a bit of a white haze with that shimmer as well. It's a really pretty one to use. So I just put that over top of those eggs, put that aside to dry, and now I'm ready to start assembling my card. So I start with that border image along the bottom of my card, and then I'm going to add the extra little die cuts to it. So I'm going to start with the stamped images first, and once I have those in the areas that I want, I'm going to take those die cut eggs and add it to these images as well. I just thought they would add a little bit of extra texture and just give it a little bit more interest by having those in behind there. And by having that yellow egg on the right hand side, it kind of ties in the bunny being a little bit more of a yellow tone on the left hand side. Once I have the stuff as well as the eggs in the bottom, then I can put those butterflies where I want them to. So I have one open butterfly and 2 side profile ones, and I'll scatter them on that background. With that done, I can trim down that border piece and glue it to my card base. Now we could leave this as is, but I'm going to add a sentiment to the background, and I'm also going to take some stickles and put that on the edges of the butterfly wings as well as the center of the flowers. The stickles are very similar to that Moondust Stickles glitter gel. They're just an opalescent glitter, and it's just going to add a little bit of extra texture and extra sparkle. One of the reasons why I like to use it on flowers is it just kind of gives that flower a center as well as something to catch the light. And then I also like to use it on the edges of butterfly wings as well. So I'll set that aside to completely dry once we have the stickles on there, and they're totally transparent. So we'll still see the color that's underneath them. That's not going to cover that in any way at all. It's just going to add that little bit of sparkle. For my next card, I'm using the From Ink to Petal press and foil plate. And because we want to have a certain area for our stenciled images and a certain area for our better press images, there is a template that goes with it, so we can tape that to the base of our better press system to know exactly where to place that flower press plate so that we have the perfect amount of space for that stenciled image. So I put that plate down. There is several different sentiments in this set as well as dies to cut out that sentiment. I chose to pick a sentiment and put it right at the top of that floral image because there's some space there. I thought it was a great place to add that sentiment in that spot. I'm using a little bit of embossing powder tool here as well. I'm going to heat emboss this with gold powder to coordinate with the rest of the sentiments and the rest of the gold embossing I have in my cards in this video. But the great thing about using press plates is you can use them in both your glimmer system as well as your better press system. You can use them like I'm using to heat emboss in the better press system, or you can just use different colors of ink or different colors of cardstock. So it's very versatile and you can get many different looks with this. I chose to stick with white hammermill cardstock here because I'm going to be using those stencils in the same colors that I've been using for the doing the bunny layering stencil. I'm going to be using those same colors so they coordinate well together. I love those bright colors for spring. So I wanted a white cardstock in order to show the vibrancy of those colors. Now, once I have that pressed image on my cardstock, I poured that embossing powder on there, tapped off any of that excess, and then used my heat tool in order to melt that powder on there. And again, I'm using gold here. You could easily swap this for black. You could swap it for a color. You could swap it for silver. So you have a lot of different creative choices with this. I'm going to put this on my sticky mat to hold it in place while I'm doing my stenciling. Now this first stencil here has one image on it. The rest of them have 2 different images on there, and there are labeled with numbers so you know exactly which order they are intended to go in. But even though we have our stencils layered with different numbers, you can go out of order. You're going to get the same image in the end. It just helps to know exactly where you're going. If you're going in order, it helps to line them up a little bit better. So I started with that first one, and there are little registration marks showing you exactly where the bottom corner of the card to make it easier to do that placing. Now, when it comes to the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th stencil, I am putting a piece of cardstock or a piece of printer paper over the top of my image, just in case I get a little bit too enthusiastic with my ink blending and go outside of that stencil. That little piece of printer paper is just going to protect my white cardstock behind there. So it's most important for when that stencil image is on the top there, but I still want to put it on there when I have that stenciled image on the bottom of the stencil, because there are those openings for those top pieces there. So I want to make sure that I have them covered so that I don't accidentally get any of the color that I have for my tulips. In this case, it's going to be some picked raspberry. I want to make sure that I'm either very careful when I'm doing my stenciling, staying away from that, or I'm going to put that printer paper on top of there. Now for this particular image, I knew that I was going to focus my color at the bottom of the tulips, and the top part was really only going to have a little bit of the ink from the edges of my brush. So I didn't have to worry about it quite so much with that one. But if you are concerned with it, you definitely, the easiest way to fix that is just to put a piece of printer paper on top of there to cover that. For the second layer, I went with that Kitsch Flamingo Distress ink. And then I'm going in with the Sunset Pink interference ink, making sure that it's heavier towards the bottom of the flower and lighter towards the top. Anytime I do flowers, I will typically pick an area where I want the color to be darker and where I want it to be lighter. Just like in my backgrounds, I don't like them to be a completely even color. I like some shadow in some areas where it's lighter and some areas where it's darker. I just think it's more visually interesting that way. Once I have that done, I'm going to go in and position the last stencil, and for that one I'm using that picked raspberry. For this one I am, because they're such small areas, I am completely covering that, and then I'm completely going over that with some Sunset Pink interference ink so that those tiny little areas are completely solid. So now we have our piece completely done here. I can trim that down and put it onto my card base. So I'm trimming this down to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. I did a little bit less trimming down on the bottom of the image, a little bit more from the top. Then I can take another piece of hammermill cardstock, trim that to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches to create a mat or a frame around that. So for that mat around there, I'm just putting some of that Sunset Pink interference ink on there. It's going to coordinate beautifully with the stenciled part. You could also just use the Kitsch Flamingo or the picked raspberry distress ink here. However, by using that interference ink on the mat, we're going to get a little bit of that beautiful shimmer that catches the light when we tilt that card as well. So it's going to coordinate perfectly with those tulips. I'll glue that to my card base, and then I'm going to glue down my image piece here. Now I didn't do that for this one here, but you could, for that last layer, you could also take that Moondust Stickles glitter gel and put it through that layer if you wanted to add a little bit of sparkle to some of those layers as well. I opted to not do it to 2 different ones. I like showing the idea, but the fact that it does take an hour for it to dry, sometimes there's just not time for that. So I opted not to do that with the second one. For my next card, I'm using the Spring Stitched Tree die set. This is the stamping die of the month, or not stamping, stitching die of the month. Now these are, to me, they looked a little bit like cherry blossoms. So I chose to die cut them in blush cardstock. The floss that I'm stitching them with is number 603. It's a nice pink. It's a little bit darker than the color that I die cut it from. Anytime I'm doing stitching dies, I like to tape that floss in place with a little bit of Best Ever Craft tape to hold that in place. Then I do my stitching, and when you die cut these pieces, little lines get indented in there showing you exactly where they intend for the stitching to go, so it's very easy to do. Once I have that stitching finished, I will put a little piece of tape on that back, and then I will trim that floss off. Now this die has the flowers that are intended to be stitched and also has some solid flowers. What I like to do with solid pieces is I glue them to the back. It gives it a little bit of extra dimension. It also seals that floss in behind, so we don't see any of that. It makes it easier for assembling the card. I have some sewing clips here that I like to use to hold those pieces in place, and I'll set those aside to dry while I'm working on the rest of the stitching flowers. Now I'm going to do 3 large ones, 3 small ones. I'm just going to do one of each on screen because the rest of it is really repetitive. The flowers are exactly the same stitched. The smaller ones, it's just a little bit harder to hide that Best Ever Craft tape behind there, but I try to hide it in a solid area, or when I do finish off my stitching, I'll hide it behind that inner hole because there is a center for the flower that gets glued right on that center hole. So even if we see a little bit of that yellow tape, it's going to be covered with the center of the flower. So we're not going to see that when it's completely done. So this particular die set has solid flowers as well as the stitching ones, and I'm using the solid ones to glue behind the stitching ones. You could also use the solid ones as a detail on your tree. If by chance I have a set that doesn't have solid ones to go behind it, I just cut the stitched ones again, and I'll just glue that behind it. Again, it helps when you're, or it makes it easier when you're assembling your cards because you have the floss already colored or covered. It adds that little bit of dimension, and when it comes time to gluing your card together, you're gluing cardstock to cardstock and you're not worrying about that floss. So I did the rest of them off screen, and here are those finished flowers. I just love the detail that stitching gives to the die cuts. It just gives it a unique look to it. I have a bunch of the leaves die cut from some peridot cardstock as well as rainforest cardstock, and I'm ink blending a little bit of that summer garden interference ink just towards the base of the leaves. Again, it just gives them a little bit of shading. It gives them just a touch of shimmer, but it adds that extra visual dimension to it. So once I have that done, I'm also doing it to the sentiment. This one says Happy Spring. There's a little flag die in this set, and there's two different sentiments to choose from. I chose the Happy Spring one, and I did a little bit of the interference ink towards the bottom of it, so it has a little bit of an ombre look. Now for the mat for this card, I have some acorn cardstock. This one I used to die cut the tree trunk out of the center. We're just going to trim that down to go behind our white piece here. So that acorn cardstock was trimmed down to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. And then we have a piece of hammer mill here that I've trimmed to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. And we're doing the same ink blending on the back so that we have some color behind that tree. So once again, the bottom is done with bundle sage as well as peeled paint. The top is done first with tumble glass, and then I'll go and do a little bit of broken china right around the outside edges to frame it in a little bit. And you can see that I'm not being super careful between the bundled sage or the greens and the blues. I kind of overlap them a little bit. Again, we're not going for detail here. We're just going for the color suggestion behind the images, behind the die cuts, just the look of grass and sky behind there. So I'm going to glue the mat onto my card base first. And I like to die cut pieces out of my mat for the fronts of my cards because they're being covered by, in this case, the hammer mill that was ink blended. You're never going to know that that piece was die cut out of. And it just extends the cardstock a little bit. I especially do this with specialty cardstocks because they are a little bit more pricey, but I do it with my solid cardstocks as well because it just extends your cardstock just a little bit. So once I have that ink blended background down, I can glue down that trunk as well as the little grass mound. Then I'm going to glue down my leaves, and I start with the darker leaves first, and then I will go in and do my lighter leaves. The last thing I'm going to add is my flowers. Some of them are going to be glued flat onto the card, and some are going to be glued with some thin foam tape just to give them a little bit of extra dimension. Now there's several different leaf and leaf clusters to choose from here. I did a variety of each one of them, and you can even do more. If you want your tree to be a lot fuller, you can die cut a lot more leaves. I chose to just have the leaves toward the outside areas and more of the florals towards the center. I wanted to still see a little bit of that background, but you could certainly do more die cut leaves if you wanted to fill it in a little bit more and have it just a little bit fuller. I love the fact that with card making, you can pick and choose what works best for you. So what works for one person might not be the best choice for another. And it just makes things interesting by doing it that way. And I chose to do these flowers in a light pink because they reminded me of cherry blossoms. But again, you can pick and choose what colors you want those florals to be. I think these would also be great in stitched with metallic floss as well to add that little metallic touch to it. So again, I'm going to glue several of them flat onto the piece, and then the last ones, the smaller ones, are going to be glued with some thin foam tape. I didn't want anything that had too much dimension to it, but I wanted to have some layers where it looked like some flowers were towards the back and some are a little bit towards the front. The last step for these flowers is I wanted to add a little gem to the center. So I have some opalescent or opal gems here. These are from Spellbinders. They come with 4 different sizes on the sheet. I'm using the teeniest ones for the small flowers and then the next size up for the larger flowers. This way I could still see a little bit of that yellow die cut for the flower center that I have on there. It's not covering that, it's just kind of going in the center of that, but it's going to add just a little bit of sparkle to that center. Another option here would be, say, a dot of stickles. We would still get a little bit of that sparkle and you'd still be able to see that yellow cardstock behind there. But I just love how that stitching just adds that extra little bit of texture and detail to these cards and just really finishes those flowers off. For the next 2 cards, I'm going to be using the Spring Haul Die of the Month. I opted to do 2 cards with this because there's a lot of different options to put in that wheelbarrow. So this first card here, I'm going to be doing some greenery and floral, and then my second card, I'm going to be doing some of the Easter eggs in that die set because I just thought they were fun to have in that wheelbarrow. So I have some greenery die cuts here that I ink blended with the Summer Garden Interference ink, and then I have some pink die cuts that are done with Wildberry as well as blush cardstock, and those were ink blended with that Sunset Pink Interference ink. So we get a little bit of shimmer with that die cut. The base of the wheelbarrow is done with fog cardstock, and I also did the behind this pierced piece in that same fog cardstock so that you could see that detail behind the one that is die cut with Wildberry cardstock. So there's 2 wheel pieces here. They get die cut at the same time. I'm just going to layer those on top of each other. You could also do a little bit of ink blending on them or die cut them out of different colors. And then there's also a top edge for that wheelbarrow that I'm going to glue on there. I have a large acrylic block on here that I just put everything together and then put that block on top of it to hold it down nice and flat while that glue starts to set. Then I'm going to take those flower heads and put them on top of the stem so that they're ready to poke into that wheelbarrow as well. I opted to do 2 colors for these flowers because it just adds a little bit of extra dimension to it. And again, you can pick and choose whatever color flowers you want. I love the fact that these die cut pieces are so tiny, so you can use a lot of different cardstock scraps with them and use those pieces up. So once I have all of my pieces ready to go, I'm just going to create the background for my card. I'm using that Spring Stripes embossing folder of the month. I'm doing it horizontally across the card. I kind of thought once it's ink blended, it looks a little bit like clouds in the sky. I just thought it kind of looked neat for a background. You could also do it vertically if you would prefer it that way. I just thought I just really liked the look of it horizontal. For the mat for this card, I'm using some Anchor cardstock. This is the same color that the wheel and some of the accents for the wheelbarrow were done in. You could also just use Hammermill cardstock and ink blend on it, but I like the brown or the gray that ties in with that wheelbarrow. For the background, I'm going to use those same 4 colors for my background, just bringing out that embossed detail. I love when you do an embossed background and do ink blending on it. It just really brings out all of that embossed detail and really lets you see it. This is just going to add some texture to the background of the card. But again, you could eliminate the embossing if you don't necessarily like it. You could just have a flat piece of cardstock. But again, I think it does add a lot of texture to that background. So after embossing it, I did trim that down to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. This anchor piece was trimmed to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. So we're going to have a nice border around our embossed piece before we add our wheelbarrow. Now, one of the great things about using liquid glue, when I go to add the wheelbarrow down, it doesn't set right away. So I have some time to be tucking things in behind it. I don't have to worry about making sure I have everything placed perfectly. So I have that acrylic block on top of there. I kind of place a few things just so that I know where I'm going and that it's going to look fine. The idea that I have in my head. I'll glue down that wheelbarrow, but you can see I glued down the bottom part. I didn't really put any glue in the top part because I'm going to be lifting it up and putting those greenery and the floral pieces in there anyways. So I put the sentiment towards the bottom. You could also lower this a little bit and put the sentiment towards the top if you wanted. It'll work perfectly in either place. Now, these stems for these tulips are really quite long. Some of them I'll leave them as is. Other ones I'll just rip them smaller. You could also use scissors if you want, but because they're such tiny pieces, it works really easy to rip them. And because we are going to put them in the wheelbarrow, we're never going to see what the bottom of the piece looks like. So we don't necessarily need to make it look nice at the bottom because, again, we're not going to see it. So I did the tulips and the greenery on the left side. I'm going to do the same thing on the right side, and then we're going to meet in the middle. So you can see that I'm doing some tulips that are taller, some that are shorter. I did four of each color. And I think I did 7 total. But you could easily do a lot more if you wanted to fill them in even more. I typically, when I do flowers, I typically like to have odd numbers, and will kind of work my way to have that because I just think they look a little bit more interesting. And then same with the greenery. I have 5 different sprigs of greenery. There's other options in this die set. Those shapes just weren't my favorite. I just didn't really like those shapes, so I opted not to use them. And that's where I love having a lot of variety, so you can pick and choose which pieces work best for you. So that card is done. I'm going to do another very similar card, but for this one, I'm going to have Easter eggs in that wagon. I'm using or just white cardstock for die cutting those eggs. Now there are dies in this set to put pattern in on those eggs. If you wanted to do that, you could layer them on top of each other. I opted to keep them totally plain. I'm ink blending them with those interference inks. So I have first that sunset pink, then that summer garden, and then lastly some opal blush. So it has a blue color to it, but it has a pink interference. Then I used the Silver Shine pad from Lisa Horton Crafts, ink blending over top of the fog cardstock. So we're going to have a silver wheelbarrow here. So there is a base part to that wheelbarrow as well as the pierced part. The base part is just cut out of fog cardstock, not ink blended. So it's going to have a different finish than the top part. And then I'm going to add the wheels to that wheelbarrow. Now, this particular die set also has some adorable little bunny ears that you can put on those eggs. I die cut them out of some velvet cardstock, and I'm using that same velvet cardstock in my next card. I love using velvet cardstock for animals because it effortlessly gives you some fuzz, some texture, and just something to touch on your card. Now, I think these ears, because of the shape of them, I think they're intended to just go right on top of an egg. I chose to do them, and I'm tucking them behind the egg as if the Easter bunny is behind the pile of eggs in the wheelbarrow. I just thought it was a fun way to do it, but you could certainly put them on top of one of those eggs. And again, there are some pieces in this die set, so you can have patterned eggs if you prefer that. For the background for this one, I'm using the 3D embossing folder of the month, the Shady Leaves. But again, you could do a flat background here. We got a lot of texture between all of the die cuts, the interference ink, as well as the velvet cardstock. I always love having embossed backgrounds. I think it just adds texture to that background. But if it's too much for you, you can definitely leave that off. I trimmed down a piece of cardstock for the mat that was 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. This embossed piece is 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches, and I'm going to ink blend them with the same 4 colors that I've been using for those backgrounds for the other cards as well. Again, there's just a very basic color palette for a background, but I just really love the look of the color in that background, and I love how doing that ink blending brings out all that embossed texture. So once our ink blending here is done, the assembly is very similar to the last card, just with different contents in the wheelbarrow, as well as a different color palette for that wheelbarrow. So first I put that mat down, and that one is also die cut or trimmed with anchor cardstock. It's going to coordinate nicely with the gray tones in that wheelbarrow. Then I'm going to put my sentiment down towards the bottom. Again, this could easily be put towards the top if you'd prefer it there. And then I can glue down that wheelbarrow and then start putting those eggs in the basket. Now I only have one egg that is colored in a blue tone. Now it's not the same blue tone as the sky, so I'm going to put that towards the front of the wagon. I'm going to put some towards the back that are going to go behind that blue one, because I want to make sure that I don't have blue on the sky. And again, if you chose to do the eggs with the patterns to them, of course, that's going to have a completely different texture from that sky. The last thing I'm going to do is those little bunny ears. I did glue down the pink parts behind there, so we have some little pink accents. I'm going to glue this behind the eggs. So again, it's going to look like the Easter bunny is hiding behind those eggs. Now, those ears were done with that velvet cardstock, so it's really hard to see it on screen, but it has a beautiful fuzzy texture to it. So this brownie gray color here for the bunny is that velvet cardstock. I love doing it with animals or things that are soft because it just easily adds extra texture to cards, and it's really easy to use. It has adhesive on the back of it. Typically what I do is I put it onto scrap piece of cardstock and then die cut it. It die cuts just like regular cardstock. It's really easy to use. The main thing with it though, when you're gluing things on top of it, it does take a little bit extra longer or extra long to dry, longer to dry than cardstock, because that glue first wants to absorb into that velvet cardstock and then it starts to set. So I do give it longer to dry than I typically would when I'm gluing cardstock together. For my florals for on top of the bunny's head, I have some white ones here that I'm ink blending with the pearl ink that I used on the eggs earlier. I'm also doing a tiny little bit of that opal blush in the center of the flower. So we have that shimmer on the outside of the petals and a little bit of the blue on the inside. I use that sunset pink on the large pink flower, and then on the bunny ears, as well as the little tie that's going to go around his head. I just used that the picked raspberry distress ink. I didn't really want anything shimmery for that. I used a little bit of that sunset pink on the pink flowers. And this particular guy has some large specks, hence the name Spring Specks. So you can pick and choose what words you want. I chose Happy Spring. I think the other option was Happy Easter. I did the frames of the glasses out of pearl cardstock from the antique white treasured cardstock pack. So it has some shimmer to it that has a little bit of a gold shine to it. I wanted to have that shimmer. I wanted those glasses to look a little bit different from regular cardstock. The other thing, I want it to look like it has lenses in it. So I took pieces of acetate. I'm trimming them down to glue behind those specks. So when the card is completely done and we tilt it into the light, it looks like there's lenses in the glass. So it doesn't need to be trimmed down nice and pretty at all because it's just going behind those die cuts. I just need to make sure that we don't see any of the corners of that acetate outside of the frames of those glasses. So I'll let that dry for a few moments, and then I'm going to glue those glasses to the little nose piece for the inside. Once I have let that set for a few moments, I'll just set that aside to dry further while I'm working on the base of the bunny on the card base. So I'm not going to put anything behind the bunny die cut here. I'm just going to glue the bunny right to the card base. So all of the pieces of that bunny are done with that velvet cardstock except for the pink inside the ears, as well as the pink on the cheeks and nose, and then the black behind his eyes. That's just regular cardstock. We didn't really need anything extra fuzzy with that. I also like the combination of regular cardstock with that velvet cardstock. So this guy is really quite large, so he fits that whole card base. Again, this is an A2 card. So I'm going to glue everything right to that card base. And then I'm going to glue the details on the front of him. So that's the nose and the cheeks. And then I will put my acrylic block on there and just let it dry for a few moments before I continue. I want to make sure that some of those pieces have a chance to start to set, and then I'll continue. So for the next step, I'm going to add the glasses to the front of him. And like I said before, when you're gluing on top of that velvet, it just takes a little bit longer than regular cardstock. And if by chance you don't wait long enough, then it's just going to lift right off of there. So it's much easier to wait a little bit longer and know that things are actually set. So once I've let that set, I'm gluing his little scarf on. So I glue the piece around the neck, the two little scarf pieces, and then there's a little knot piece. These are the pieces that I did a little bit of ink blending on at the beginning of this particular card. That ink blending just adds some visual dimension to it. You don't necessarily need to do it to it, but I think it just adds extra detail, and it's really quite easy to do. When I do my flowers here, I'm starting with the bigger ones that have the longer stems and kind of working my way from the back to the front. I do a lot of florals on cards. I've done them for years, so I'm really quite familiar with them. I have an idea of where I want everything to be put. If you're not familiar with them, what I would suggest is using an acrylic block like I have, laying it on top of your cards. You can lay your florals out so you can see exactly what it's going to look like on your card. Then you can lift it up, move it to the side, and then place those pieces right onto your card, knowing exactly where they go. Now I forgot to die cut the little tiny piece for that large pink flower there, so I just did that off screen, glued that to the center. So this one has so much dimension to it, between the velvet cardstock, the pearl cardstock for the glasses, the acetate for the glass, the inside of the glasses, and then all of those floral die cuts. And I just love the look of them. Perfect for spring. For this next card here, I'm using the Create exclusive die set. This one is Lively Blooms. These pieces were all die cut from Hammermill cardstock, and then I'm going to use the inks to color them. Now, by doing this, you get a different look than if you're using solid color cardstock, because some of the tips of those pieces are nearly white, and then you get a lot of color variation. So I started with the peeled paint for the stems and leaves, and then I went in with the Summer Garden Interference ink for the stems and leaves. For the solid parts of the flowers, I just did Picked Raspberry Distress ink. And then for these open pieces that get put on top of those solid pieces, for this one I used the Sunset Pink Interference pad. So we're going to get a combination of the Distress ink as well as the beautiful shine from those interference inks on that detailed piece there. Once again, I'm using that liquid glue with the fine tip bottle, so it makes pieces like this really easy to put together. If you look at the base, you can't see it on the video. It does have lines showing you exactly where those upper pieces go. So as I'm placing them on, you'll see that I kind of move, and what I'm doing is looking at those lines showing me exactly where those pieces go so that I can lay them over top of them. Much easier to lay them over top when you have them orientated correctly to begin with. So after putting those two pieces together, I put my acrylic block on top of there, let that sit for a few moments so that that glue can start to set. Then I can add my flowers to the tops of those stems. I'm not going to put the greenery on them yet. I will put them together with them when I assemble my card. For the background for this one, I'm using the 3D embossing folder Shady Leaves for that background. And again, I'm going to do that ink blending just like I've done for the rest of the cards. The only thing with this is I'm going to have my green on the bottom, kind of going up the left-hand side. My blue is going to be on the top, going down the right-hand side. So it's going to be a little bit more angled rather than kind of straight across. So my mat for this card is trimmed to 4 inches by 5¼ inches. I'm inking it with that Sunset Pink Interference pad, so it's going to tie in with those flowers. I'll clean that up, set that aside to dry. My embossed piece here was trimmed down to 3¾ inches by 5 inches. I like to trim my embossed pieces after I've embossed them. Sometimes when you emboss, especially 3D embossing folders, all that detail kind of skews the measurements to the card. So I like a little bit bigger piece of cardstock, and then I trim them down afterwards. And then I do my ink blending. Because I like to do my ink blending where I have it darker around the outside edges, having it already trimmed lets me have control over exactly where that dark edge is. So you can see here how that blue and the green is kind of angled, a little bit different from the way I've done most of my backgrounds. Now we're ready to assemble it. So I'm going to put that mat down first. Then I'm going to put my embossed piece down on the front of that. And anytime I'm adding glue to an embossed piece, I make sure to add lots of glue to the recessed pieces, the pieces that are going to have contact with the cardstock underneath them. I want to make sure that it is glued down nice and well, and that's the best way to do that. I'm going to take the longest leaf of that greenery, put it in the back of my card. Now again, I have an idea where exactly I want all of these pieces to go. If you're new to die cuts and florals, you can lay them all down first and then glue them all down. You don't have to glue them down as you're placing them, but I just knew I wanted my florals to be towards the left side of this card with the greenery mixed all in between it. And then the last thing I'm going to do is add a sentiment right over top of the bottom of the leaves of those greens. Typically I'll put a sentiment towards the bottom of the leaves because the leaves aren't really the most interesting part of florals. So it kind of hides that, it kind of ties it all in together. So I choose one of the sentiments, put glue on the back, and then add it to the bottom. Now, when I was gluing those pieces down, you could see that the stems were going outside of the embossed piece. So after it was glued down, I just used my detailed scissors in order to trim those stems right to the bottom of that card. For the last card here, I'm going to be using the Lively Blooms, the Season of Faith die set. This one is the Crate Club bonus item. This one I thought would be really fun to do a light up card with. So I have a lot of pieces die cut here ready to go. I have some clouds die cut out of fog cardstock, some bushes here die cut out of rainforest cardstock. The bushes I'm ink blending with that Summer Garden Interference ink. The clouds, I'm just doing a little bit of that silver ink just at the bottom of them, just to give them a bit of a metallic touch. Those pieces are supposed to be bushes, but I just thought they looked like the shape of clouds, so why not use them for both? I have a piece of hammer mill cardstock here that is 4¼ inches by 5½ inches for my background. I'm going to die cut my church outline out of it so that I can have an opening that I cover with vellum so that I have an area that is going to be showing that light. This is a one light from Pear Blossom Press. It comes with batteries. The battery, as well as the little piece to put the battery in, has a plus sign, and you just make those plus signs match. I always test while I'm working on them to make sure that they're going to work throughout the whole thing. I want to make sure that everything works while I'm doing it. So I pick where I want that church to go, tape that die in place and die cut it. Then I'm going to take the embossing folder of the month, the Spring Stripes, and I'm going to emboss that background just for a little bit of embossed detail. This is another step that could be eliminated if you don't want that embossing on that background. If you want it more just flat cardstock, you could leave it as flat cardstock. Now, one step that I forget here that I don't realize until towards the end of the card when it's too late, I don't trim this piece down. Now, what I had intended to do was trim this piece down to 3¾ inches by 5 inches. That's why I had put down a piece of anchor cardstock on my card base, as well as a smaller piece of Hammer's Mill cardstock on top of that. The Hammer Mill cardstock was so that the piece showing through my windows was white and not a dark gray. I didn't want my windows being dark. But again, I forgot to do that. So this isn't how I intended for this card to look. You're going to see how I come up with a fix at the end. But I just wanted to mention that at this point, because if you do want to trim it down so it's smaller than that mat, that would need to be done at this point before starting to glue everything together. Once I have that ink blending done, I glued that to a piece of vellum. I have 3 of these churches done with those inlays with the windows. I wanted to have it popping a little bit out of the front of the card. This you don't necessarily need. You only need 1, but again, I wanted to give it that little bit of extra dimension. For the cross on top of the steeple, I have that die cut out of some glossy gold cardstock. This is just a scrap that I have had in my bin. So I use that same gold cardstock for the centers of some of the flowers on top of that bunny. Just adds a little pop of metallic accent. Then I have some anchor cardstock here for the top of the steeple as well as the top of the roof, gluing that on there. Now I hadn't decided whether I wanted a gray door or a red door. I decided to do the red one, but I figured I might as well glue down the gray one, put the red one right on top of it, so it's going to give that a little bit of extra dimension as well. Once this is totally done, I can glue this right on top of that vellum piece that we have die cut out of the center here, and then we can let that dry for just a few moments. Now that one light from Pear Blossom Press has a little button that you press on it to make that light turn on. So I want to give the recipient an idea of what to do with this card when they receive it. So I have a stamp here. It says push here. This is from a little stamp and die set from Pear Blossom Press. I stamped it with some peeled paint distress ink. I wanted it to tie in with the bush, but I wanted you to be able to see press here. Now I know from testing my light here that trigger is going to be just to the right of my door. So that's where I'm going to be putting that bush that says press here. And it doesn't need to necessarily be exactly on that trigger. As long as you're pressing close to it, it's going to turn that light on. I use a little bit of Sukwang tape here. This is 1/4" Sukwang tape. It's a permanent tape to glue that light in place. And then I'm going to glue that bush in place so that I have that single bush that says push here right above that trigger. So I know that when I give this to someone, they're going to know exactly what to do with it because it's going to tell them to push here. Now, this battery pack for the one light has a little bit of dimension to it. So you want to use some foam tape on the back of this piece here. I have some double thick foam tape here. It is 3 millimeters thick. It's the perfect thickness for this type of light. If you don't have foam tape that's this thick, you could do a double layer or a triple layer, just depending on how thick your foam is, to create that dimension. You want to make sure that your tape is just a little bit thicker than that battery pack. Otherwise, you're going to have a bump in the middle of your card. So I put that tape all the way around the outside of my card, and then I'm putting a little bit towards the open areas right on either side and above that steeple, so that that has a little bit of structure and stability to it as well. Then I can start taking the backings off of this tape. Now, this tape was from Pear Blossom Press. They are out of stock right now, but I found an alternative, and I'll put that in the supply list. This is the point where I realized that I had forgotten to trim my emboss piece down. So originally I turned it over. Sometimes there's space around the outside edges to trim things. There wasn't space, and I didn't want to take that tape off. For me, these times are times when you get creatively challenged, and I kind of like when that happens. So what I did was I took my Matting Basics A die set. I chose 2 dies with some white cardstock to create a frame. And then I'm going to put that on the front of the card. Now, I chose to do white here. I thought anchor would look great as well. I didn't really want... I opted not to do the anchor because I thought it might be a little bit dark and maybe take away from the church. So I opted to do just the white in its place. But again, it's just one of those opportunities to get a little bit creative and do something that you hadn't intended to do, and stretch your creative brain just a little bit. Sometimes those opportunities are frustrating, and sometimes they're great. So first thing I'm going to do here is fill in the area of the sky with some of those clouds. Now, you could leave those cloud die cuts intact, but what I like to do is die cut a few of them, or one of them in half. Put one of them toward the right hand or right side of that frame, to put another towards the left side of the frame. As I'm placing those clouds, I'm making sure that some of them are higher, some of them are lower. I'm not doing them symmetrical at all. I want to kind of make it look like a realistic scattered clouds in the sky type thing. I do that same thing with the bushes. I'll take one of them, and this is one of the long ones that are the same shape as the clouds. I cut it in probably about 2/3. I didn't really want it right in half. One of those pieces are going to go towards the right of the church. One is going to go towards the left of the church. And it just kind of changes up the shape of some of those bushes. Make sure that some of them look like they're going behind the card. So here is the finished card. Again, not as I had intended, because there's a piece of anchor cardstock hiding behind it, but you would never know that. So sometimes it's great to come up, or to have these things come up that you don't necessarily plan for, but make you change up your design. Then we have our card done with the Lively Blooms Crate exclusive. And again, these flowers, they can be done in a variety of different colors, so you can get really creative with your color palettes for them. Then we have our absolutely adorable Spring Specs large bunny die. This one is really perfect for Easter. You could also just do it for a rabbit lover too, but I just think he's absolutely adorable. And I think he's adorable without those specs, but because they're just so bold, I thought they had to be used. Then we have our wagon full of eggs, as well as the bunny poking out behind it. Then our wagon full of florals. Again, same die set, but we have a completely different look, just because the colors are changed just a little bit, as well as the contents of that little wagon. Then we have our stitched spring tree here. Lots of dimension because of that stitching. And you can see how with that same color palette throughout, all these cards look nice together, but they have such a bold, beautiful spring color palette to them. And then we have our press and foil, the ink from ink to petal press and foil with that layered stencil. I love the look that that gives. This one here was done with our clear stamp of the month from our Ears to Spring, with so many different sentiments to choose. And like I said, I have leftover ones that I'm going to be saving for future projects. This here, Botanical Bunny, was done with the stencil of the month. Again, adorable for Easter or even a rabbit lover. Just a unique look to it. And then our very first one, which was a very, very simple technique, but has a really pretty look to it, done with the Shady Leaves embossing folder of the month. So 10 different ideas to use with the clubs for this month. I absolutely love how beautiful and spring and floral they are. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate all the time that you spend with me. I hope you have a fantastic day.